Hi everyone and welcome! Today we're talking about the early Greek culture called the Minoans, and especially the Minoans in relationship to the Greek myth of the Minotaur, using that story as a kind of pathway into the Minoan culture and its legacy. The Minoans were a people centered on the island of Crete in the Aegean Sea, and on one or two other much smaller islands nearby. They emerged around 1900 BC, and they overlap chronologically, but not geographically, with the prehistoric culture on the Cyclades Islands that we know pretty much nothing about. The Minoans were contemporary, roughly, with the Middle and early New Kingdoms of Egypt and the Babylonian Empire in the Near East. We also know that the Minoans were partially contemporaneous with the Mycenaean culture that dominated mainland Greece. The Mycenaeans were the people immortalized in Homer's great epic, the Iliad. It's set around 1300 BC and describes the various Mycenaean city-states at war against the Trojans. In the 18th and 19th centuries AD, people began rediscovering and excavating these sites that were associated with the Iliad, locating Mycenae, for example, the home of the legendary Agamemnon, or Pylos, where Nestor ruled, and so forth. These were largely assumed to be the earliest Greek remains, that no civilization had existed in the Aegean prior to the Mycenaeans. Now, the ancient Greeks had stories and myths associated with Crete, in which people lived on the island, but most scholars at the time doubted that those stories were rooted in any kind of factual basis and simply wrote them off as purely made up. The archaeologist responsible for pioneering work on the Minoans and proving that they existed at all was an Englishman named Sir Arthur Evans, who was working in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. In 1900, Evans and his team began excavating on a hilltop near the modern city of Heraklion on Crete. Another archaeologist, Minos Kalakainos, had briefly excavated there about 20 years earlier, but was forced to stop after just a few weeks. Evans picked up the work and uncovered a massive architectural complex, which he called the Palace of King Minos, named after a legendary king. And so he named the civilization that had created it the Minoans. During this excavation, they found coins indicating that the site was also the same as a legendary Bronze Age city called Knossos, which is the name that we use for the site today. The so-called palace complex covers 6 acres at the top of a low hill, but the broader urban area extends much wider, with many additional homes and villas and farms in the surrounding areas. The complex itself has a very elaborate interior structure. As you can see in this artist's rendering, there were multiple stories, as many as 7, counting stories both above and below ground, since it was made on a hill. They could sort of build along the hillside to add easily more stories. They also had a really sophisticated plumbing system that used terracotta pipes to handle sewage and rainwater. Now, whenever you have a large building and no electricity, you have to deal with the question of light. So in this case, the Minoans introduced light wells that allow the circulation of air and light. They're essentially open-air staircases. The columns that you notice here are very distinctive. They are made of wood and painted in this red color. They taper downwards so that the base is smaller than they are at the top. And then the capital is this mushroom-like shape, this bulbous form that sometimes reminds me of like a squished marshmallow. Now, this form with the smaller bottom, the downward taper, was possibly inspired by the shape of stalactites. But we don't really know. Now, since these columns were made of wood, these ones that you see here are all new. They're modern reconstructions. In fact, the site was heavily reconstructed under Evans's direction, something that he's since been criticized for. So it's important to know that this is not what the place looked like upon excavation at all. It has been restored, and the way this restoration looks should be taken with a few grains of salt. The Knossos complex was covered with frescoes, many of them having a kind of ceremonial, formal character, like this procession of young men carrying different vessels. This is located in the south propylon, or gateway, into the complex, and the figures are oriented so that they seem to be processing in through the gate from right to left in this picture. It makes sense that this formal, more rigid, and hierarchical fresco subject would be placed in this location, which is a main entrance for the complex, the place where dignitaries, foreigners would be invited in, and the public at large would enter. Most of the frescoes, however, at Knossos have a much more relaxed and informal style, like this dolphin fresco. It demonstrates a sense of vivacity and interest in curvilinearity, in motion and action and energy. And it seems that rather than fulfilling some type of ritual or religious or political function, this image may have been valued for its purely decorative quality. That is, it's just pretty. There's no formality in this image at all. Marine life is a very common subject in Minoan art, and this is very typical of Minoan painting. And this subject matter makes sense considering that we have a culture living on an island in very close proximity to the sea, but also engaging in fishing and relying heavily on maritime trade. Now, this is an interesting detail about Knossos, is that it doesn't have any walls. This is very different from the later Mycenaean cities, which were heavily fortified. So this tells us that the Minoans were did not seem to see other Minoans as a threat. And they also apparently had a very capable navy that was able to stop potential threats or potential invaders before they got to the complex at Knossos. Evans called this complex structure a palace when he first excavated it, but it seems to have actually served a number of functions for the broader community. There were spaces for banqueting on the upper floors. There is an area that was probably a theater space, areas for religious activities, and shrines, and it also served as an administrative place. There were some apartments in the structure that likely belonged to the local officials. And one of the primary functions seems to have been the storage, trade, processing, and distribution of food and agricultural produce. The surrounding farms and vineyards and such would have brought their harvest to Knossos in order to sell their produce or to have it shipped off to other locations abroad. In this plan of the excavation site, you can see that these long, narrow rooms on the west side are all storage spaces or magazines. Here's what it looks like today. You'll notice that each magazine is separated by very thick walls. These are about 4 or 5 feet thick and consist of different shafts that are dug into the earth in which these large pots or pithoi would be stored. So the combination of placing the pots within the earth and these very, very thick insulating walls meant that the contents of these storage vessels were protected from the heat. This is essentially a kind of refrigeration system, a storage system. We have been able to recover some of the organic matter from inside the pithoi and find that they contained things like olive oil and grains and wine. Now, Evans named the structure at Knossos after King Minos, who was a character in the Greek myth of the Minotaur. Minos was married to Pasiphae, the queen. In the story, Poseidon, the god of the ocean and seas, gave Minos an amazing white bull, and Minos was instructed to sacrifice it to Poseidon. However, Minos did not follow this instruction, which is always a mistake. Instead, he kept the bull for himself and sacrificed a different, lesser bull in its place, somehow thinking that maybe Poseidon wouldn't notice. But of course, he did, and he was angry. So, in punishment, Poseidon had Pasiphae fall in love with the bull. So Pasiphae, in order to satiate her amorous desires, commissioned the great inventor and engineer Daedalus, from the story of Icarus and Daedalus, to create a hollow wooden cow in which Pasiphae could enter and lay down so that she could have intercourse with the bull, which she did. The resulting creature was something called the Minotaur. The Minotaur was a half bull, half human. In some stories, they say that he had the body of a bull and the torso and head of a man, kind of like a centaur is half human, half horse, but more commonly shown with the body of a human and the head of a bull. Now, the Minotaur, interestingly, reflects the transgression of Pasiphae and Minos' transgression against Poseidon. Monsters in Greek myth are always a representation of some sort of violation of the social code, of the way that things should be according to the Greeks. So in this case, the transgression was bestiality, humans having sex with animals. And so accordingly, the resulting monster is an evidence of that transgression. Similarly, Minos' disobedience towards Poseidon resulted in this perversion on Pasiphae's part, which in turn reflects the perversion of Minos' own desires. He should be devoted to Poseidon, but instead he was devoted to his own needs. He was serving himself rather than the god. Therefore, his desires were twisted. They were warped from what they should be. Now, being a monster, the Minotaur had monstrous needs, and each year, or every several years, depending on who's telling the story, Athens was obligated to send a number of young men and women to Knossos to be fed to the Minotaur. This was obviously a bad situation, so the Athenian hero Theseus, aided by the goddess Athena, voyaged to Knossos, where he slayed the Minotaur with the help of Athena and with the help of Pasiphae and Minos' daughter Ariadne. Here on the right, you can see Theseus triumphant, dragging the Minotaur out of the labyrinth where it resided, and Athena looking on from the left side. Theseus then went back to Athens. He started to take Ariadne with him and then abandoned her on an island halfway there. Not to worry, however, Dionysus came along and took her for his consort, so she wound up with the better deal anyway. So what are we to do with this story? We have a bull, or at least a bull-headed monster, perhaps child or human sacrifice involved as well. And then something called a labyrinth, which is where the myths say that the Minotaur resided. This labyrinth is sometimes called or described as a maze. And then we also have this element of the conquest of this site of Knossos or of the Minotaur by Athens in the form of Theseus. So given these key points, what are we to do with this myth? Well, for one thing, it's been suggested that the excavated site at Knossos, as you can see in this plan here, is very complex, perhaps even maze-like. in its design and in the arrangement of rooms. And perhaps this vast site gradually came to exist in the cultural memory as a maze. Maybe it turned from being a really big complex with lots of hallways and staircases that so big you could get lost in, and gradually became an actual maze. It's possible. But one of the interesting elements here is the word labyrinth. So in English, we've adopted this word to mean a maze or confusing complex of passages and rooms, and we borrowed it directly from this myth. But that's not what it means in Greek. In Greek, it actually means the hall or place of the double axes. The double axe is being the word labrys, so labyrinth, the place of the double axe. What, you may ask, is a double axe? Well, it's just an axe that has blades or heads on either side. So here is an example of several gold labrys found at another Minoan site. These were not made to be functional axes to be used. Rather, they are what are called votive objects. So they're objects that were created in order to be given as offerings to a deity or left at a shrine or a holy site as an offering. Now, to find out how this myth and its various parts connect to the site at Knossos and what they tell us about the Minoans, we'll turn to an object from a different Minoan site. The Agia Triada sarcophagus is named after its find spot on Crete, Agia Triada. And it's a piece of limestone, so this is not an assemblage of different parts. It's carved out of a single block of limestone, and then it has been plastered over and painted. There's a combination of decorative patterns. These swirling wave patterns on the legs are very characteristically Minoan. And then there are narrative or figural scenes in the form of registers on either side. And it's these scenes which we're going to turn our attention to. So on one side, we have the presentation of libations or liquid offerings, an altar. And this altar is flanked on either side by double axes. To the right of this, we have three men who are carrying offerings towards a tomb. And standing in front of this tomb, there's another man. You'll notice that there's something strange about him. He doesn't have any arms or feet, and that's because he's a ghost. Ghosts don't need feet, apparently. So this is really, really fascinating because what it tells us is that the Minoans believed that there is a spirit that survives after the death of the body, and that spirit somehow needs or should be given some kind of sustenance in the form of offerings. So that alone is absolutely fascinating. Now, part of the scene on the other side of the sarcophagus is damaged, but what remains shows the sacrifice of a bull. You can see it here on the left portion, trussed up and set on this table while two extremely scared-looking goats sit underneath. And the woman here, presumably a priestess, is washing her hands in a basin. There's a ewer of water over the basin. And right in front of her, to our right, is another double axe. And then further on the rightmost side is a shrine on which sit these four white U-shaped objects. Evans called these horns of consecration. That is, they're representations of bull's horns that had some kind of ceremonial purpose or religious symbolism. Now, you might reasonably ask, how do we know? They just look like little U-shapes. They could be anything. Well, we know because we find them all over Knossos and at other Minoan sites all across Crete. Big horns, small horns, pottery horns, stone horns that are big enough for people to sit in. We also find lots and lots of double axes all through Knossos. There are some that are functional, there are some that are votive objects like we saw before, and then there are some like the one on the bottom right, which is a graffiti axe. So what all of this tells us is that the Minoans had a fully developed religion that emphasized bulls and bull imagery for some reason. But this really, that's not too surprising. Bulls have been a reoccurring feature in art, used to symbolize power and virility and masculine strength and such for really millennia. But we also now have an explanation for how the labyrinth is connected to Knossos, because we find all of these double axes, these labyrinths everywhere in Knossos. Therefore, it becomes the hall of the double axes, the labyrinth. And we're going to turn now to another famous element of Knossos to get further clues and insights into this myth. This is one of the most famous images associated with Knossos and with the Minoans as a whole. And this is a fresco showing two women and a man leaping over a charging bull. The women are shown with white skin, and the male figure with darker tanned skin. And this is a very common way of distinguishing the sexes in throughout Mediterranean and Near Eastern cultures. The figures are showing us three different stages of this action of leaping over the bull. So it's a snapshot in time, but because they are arranged in these different poses, and they're all presumably engaged in the same action, we also have this overarching event, this motion that we can follow thanks to the positions of these three athletes. The woman on the left grabs the bull by its horns, preparing to vault herself over the bull, as we see the male figure doing here, doing a handspring off the bull's back and kind of a backflip, while the woman on the right has just landed from her vault onto the ground and has just set down on her tippy toes. Now, unlike Egyptian fresco, the Minoans worked in wet or true true fresco, which means that they covered the stone wall surface with lime and then a smooth layer of plaster, stucco, and then painted onto that plaster while it was still wet. So this causes the pigment and the plaster to actually bind together at a molecular level, which makes it more durable than dry fresco. But it's also more difficult because the artist has to determine how much area he can complete before the plaster dries out. So he had to plan very carefully what he was going to do and move very quickly. Now, a word about the appearance of this fresco. You'll notice that in this detail, it appears very patchy. And the reason for that is because it's a combination of original fresco fragments that are then filled in, or filled around, rather, with the reconstruction of what the full fresco would have looked like. So, raised areas, back here, whoops. There we go. Here we go. All right, so patches like this, or like all of this right here, these are all original pieces of the real Minoan fresco. Well, all of this stuff here, here, and these parts of the arms and such, the gaps have been filled in with paint in modern times in order to give us a complete sense of what the fresco looked like. But they've made sure that there's a sharp distinction visually between the original and the reconstruction, so that there's no mistaking which is which. Now, in order to really emphasize the action and movement of this scene, you'll notice that none of the figures have their feet really planted on any kind of ground line. Everything is fluid and in motion. The bull is in a full flat-out charge, and the artist has elongated its body, really exaggerated it to heighten a sense of emotion as all four hooves are off the ground. It's in flight, essentially. The bull's body is composed of a series of curves and counter curves. It's been simplified so that there's a wave pattern undulating across the horns, the arch of the neck, the hollow of the back, and ending in this beautiful whiplash shape. Because there are no sharp angles, it's all just one rhythmic curve. Our eyes flow smoothly along the lines without being broken up along that contour, adding to this sense of fluidity. The human figures, too, are constructed in a very typically Minoan manner, using gradual curves and rounded shapes. The figures are slender, with torso and hips swelling out in this hourglass from a teeny tiny pinched waist. They're almost completely shown in profile when that is viewed from the side, except when you see them, their eyes seem to be viewed as if from the front. Now, this was an actual activity that went on at Knossos, and probably at other Minoan sites as well. We know of similar sports in other Mediterranean cultures, and actually a kind of bull leaping is still practiced in Spain and southwestern France today. All right, let me get rid of that line. Oh, there you go. So clearly, these athletes have to be extremely physically skilled in order to perform these motions, and even more skilled to perform them while a bull is charging at them. And not just physically skilled, but also mentally conditioned to handle this kind of pressure and stress, to be able to do these feats of acrobatic, excellence, while having this deadly animal that can kill you bearing down on you. So not only would these activities have shown off the abilities of the various individual athletes performing them, but it would also have demonstrated the broader concept of mankind's power over nature. So the ability for humans to overcome incredible danger and force and brute strength through excelling at a learned skill, through techne is the Greek word, through physical training and cunning. If you think about one of the greatest heroes of Greek mythology, Odysseus excels and achieves and such through his cunning, through his intelligence, through his skill. And it's interesting that we see this theme of intellectual man versus brute force of nature at such an early stage with the Minoans, because it becomes a really core theme in the ideology of the Greeks later on, especially in the classical period, which we'll talk about in a future lecture, but doesn't come for another 1,000 years. And already we're seeing it here with the Minoans, and perhaps it was even present earlier on as well. Now, you don't have to stretch the imagination too much to see where the idea of young men and women engaging in a very dangerous and potentially fatal sport with a bull could gradually over time turn into the story of young men and women being sacrificed to a bull monster. It's probable that there was even a kind of bull leaping intramural league going on, where the different Minoan communities would compete against one another, where people from the various other Minoan towns and communities would come into Knossos to compete. Perhaps even cities from the mainland, like Athens, would have sent their young men and women to Knossos to compete in the bull leaping practice in the Labyrinth, the Hall of Double Axes. Now, this idea is especially intriguing, I think, when we consider this fresco. It's one of many frescoes found at a site in the Nile Delta where either a Minoan or Minoan-trained artists were hired to adorn a palace. The quality of the frescoes here is exceptional. This is not simply some imitation. This is very high-quality textbook Minoan art. So here we have another bull leaping scene, but what's especially interesting about this, for our purposes, is the fact that we have a Minoan bull leaping scene set in front of a maze-like geometric pattern. You'll notice that, yes, it is a repeating geometric pattern here, but it has this really intense maze-like quality that the that the bull and the athlete seem to be almost caught in. Now, around the same time, we see the emergence, as I mentioned earlier, of a distinct culture on mainland Greece that we call the Mycenaeans, after one of several sites. Now, this was the era associated with the heroes of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, the time when the Trojan War was believed to have taken place. Now, early archaeologists wanted to find evidence of those heroes and stories, and one of these archaeologists was the controversial but famous Heinrich Schliemann, who famously led the excavation of Troy itself. Now, Schliemann also led excavations of Mycenaean sites, and it was he who excavated the citadel at Mycenae, which is where the name Mycenaean is derived from. The Mycenaeans, interestingly, were not a cohesive nation by any means whatsoever. Instead, they were a series of very small city-states or kingdoms, and they had a shared culture, language, and religion, but each city-state worshipped or had their own patron deity. And they were also constantly at war with one another. And you'll notice that, unlike Knossos, Mycenae is extremely fortified. It has very thick walls that surround the entire, what we call Acropolis, the high city. Now, there is not too much left of Mycenae today. It's not in the best shape ever, but enough of it remains to identify one of the most famous sites, or parts of the site, and that is the Lion Gate. The Lion Gate was so famous that it was described by ancient Greek and Roman travelers. And so when people were excavating it, they were able to, or visiting the site, they were able to see the Lion Gate and were able then to identify this location as Mycenae through that site that was described in the ancient texts. Now, what's really cool about the Lion Gate is that these lions, which today their heads are gone, they would have been attached by different stones, but you can see what they would have looked like in this reconstruction. These lions are flanking either side of something that should look familiar. That is a Minoan column. Now, what is a Minoan column doing in this pride of place position over the main entrance of a Mycenaean fortress? Well, we don't really know. We don't know why it was so important or what it might have meant or symbolized to people, but it clearly means that there was cultural contact between Mycenae and the Minoans, and that the Mycenaeans valued this element of Minoan visual culture enough to include it, enough to incorporate it into their own fortress. Now, another Mycenaean site is that of Pylos, also in Greece. And it is a site that has been excavated or is being excavated and worked on by a team from the University of Cincinnati. One of the most exciting finds, not just from Pylos, but really from Mycenaean archaeology as a whole, is the tomb of the so-called Griffin warrior, which you see the archaeological team working on in the picture here. It is a shaft grave, which means that it is dug down into the earth in a shaft and then lined with stone. And then the body and whatever grave goods were to be included would be put in and then covered up with dirt. And you can see, looking down into the tomb here, the edges of some of the objects that were left with the body. Now, the reason it's called the deceased, which was a male, is called the Griffin Warrior, is because he was dressed in an extremely fine armor, and it's unlikely that he was simply a warrior. He was clearly a king or an extremely important person because of the quantity and quality of the objects that were buried with him. One of those objects was a signet ring, which had a griffin on it, thus giving him the name of the Griffin Warrior. Some of the objects that were buried here are a sword, you can see on the left, some beads and gems that would have been originally affixed either to a necklace or some sort of organic material that's since disappeared. There are a lot of other bronze fragments, as you can see. On the right, a bronze mirror that has an ivory handle, and this would have been an extremely precious item. And we can only imagine who this person was to have merited such a burial. You can see that over time, objects that would have been either on the deceased's clothing or on the body have since sunk down as the body decomposes into the bones. We can see some of the ribs here and the gems interspersed with it. But once we get these things out of the grave and can take a good look at them, we find some interesting things. Like this signet ring, for example, which if you take a good look, you'll be able to recognize a Minoan bull leaping scene, just like the one we looked at Knossos. So here we have a bull in a charge, again, all 4 feet off the ground, shown in profile, and leaping over him, having completed the jump, is a human. He has, for some reason, extremely long arms, a torso and 2 legs, and the head is right here. So this is really fascinating. We have just found a Minoan ring showing a Minoan bull leaping scene in a Mycenaean grave. So this shows us that not only did the Minoans and Mycenaeans have cultural contact, it also tells us that the Minoans were extremely skilled craftsmen, that they crafted luxury objects that were desirable to a larger market, including the Mycenaeans. That the Mycenaeans could afford to purchase things like this, and that they were held in such high regard that they would be buried with a person of this importance and this magnitude. Whoever this person was, he was the kind of person where you're going to put the best stuff with him. You're not going to put junk in there. So clearly the inclusion of this ring signals its value, its importance, its sort of desirability. Now, the Minoans kind of faded out. The site at Knossos was sort of semi-abandoned, but then the Mycenaeans moved into it, and we see a shift in the writing style. There's 2 different alphabets that are used. Linear A, which was used primarily by the Minoans, and Linear B, used by the Mycenaeans. We have deciphered Linear B, but not Linear A. And we see a shift at Knossos from A to B. We are pretty sure that the Mycenaeans kind of took over the place at some point. In 1100 BC, there is a collapse. 60% of the Greek population dies. The Peloponnesus is deserted. There are fires at pretty much all of the Mycenaean citadels. And for some reason, the cities are abandoned as people move inland to these rugged mountain regions, away from the coastlines and the sea. art production ceases entirely and literacy dies out. When written records reemerge hundreds of years later, they are in an entirely different alphabet. So the verbal language and some of the culture continues, but the written language disappears. We don't know why this happened, but it happened, or similar, events happened all around the Mediterranean to many different cultures at this exact moment. And this is an event referred to as the Bronze Age collapse. There's no sign of invasion. It's possible that there was a plague, but we don't really find the quantity of bodies that would be appropriate for that. So what we think is what happened is essentially a systems collapse, that the broader network of the Mediterranean at this time was so interdependent, so intertwined, and also so rather sophisticated that when one element broke down, it triggered a kind of domino effect that put strain on all of the other points within the network and eventually just kind of fell apart. Some cultures were able to kind of struggle through. Others, like the Minoans and Mycenaeans, disappeared. And their histories passed into legend and myth. 1,000 years later, the classical Greeks minted coins at Knossos, which had been re-inhabited by that time by the later Greeks, and would continue into the Roman period to be occupied to a greater or lesser degree. And you'll notice that even now there is a very strong connection in the Greek mind between the site of Knossos, the Minotaur, and the Labyrinth. Strong enough that these became defining images of Knossos. We have here the Minotaur at the head of the bull and the body of a man running, and then this cruciform labyrinth on the obverse side, and then on another coin minted later, we have a much more clearly defined labyrinth, maze-like structure.